I'm Hellgas, and I absolutely love fighting games. It has to be in my top 3 favorite genres of games, right besides FPS and RPGs. Even with my love of the genre, I'm a casual player of these, hopping in for a month or two before moving on to the next game, but I want to get deeper into the genre and find what I love about these games. Now I could achieve this by playing the newest games, but I don't really want to do that. Instead I'll be playing older games from different generations, so that we can see how the industry has changed throughout time. After each review they'll go on a tier list. Now to prevent me from getting overwhelmed with the amount of fighting games, I'll be sticking with a single console and playing everything it has. Starting us off will be the Nintendo 64, since it has about 20-ish fighting games, with the first one we're covering is Fighter's Destiny. This section will be us going through the game's development and giving some context on how it was received back then. Now I'm starting in the 3D era of fighters, so I'm not expecting many of these to really age well, but some of these games were great for their time and I really want to highlight how good they were for their time. Since it's easy for us in 2023 to poke and laugh at some of these games, unfortunately Fighter's Destiny doesn't have too much development information out there, but it was developed by Genki, who at the time really loved to make mech and street racing games. On occasion they'll throw their hats into the ring with some random genres, leading to them making a few fighting games, from a 2D all-female comedic fighter, Safuku Densetsu Pretty Fighter. God, I hope I said that right because Japanese is hard. A game with an all-female cast wasn't really seen much in the early 90s. So for the PlayStation 1's 3D spin-off, Fist, they decided to add some tough guys for some reason. But Genki was a big supporter of the Dreamcast, to the point where Sega even noticed them, hiring Genki to port Virtual Fighter 3 TB, which came out the same year as Fighter's Destiny, at least in Japan. With the amount of Dreamcast experience they have, I'm surprised that Fighter's Destiny wasn't an exclusive, especially when you consider that the Dreamcast only had 3 fighting game exclusives: Street Fighter 3 New Generation, Mortal Kombat Gold, and Frame Grid. I wish there was more information out there on Fighter's Destiny to understand why it didn't appear on the Dreamcast, as all it needed was a little bit more work, mainly on the graphics side of things, and it could have been a killer fighting exclusive for the system. Instead, it became a Nintendo 64 exclusive, releasing in 1998. The game was received well by many critics, loving the unique points system, and the gameplay was overall just better than most other N64 fighting games. The biggest critiques was the game's graphics, but with graphics being the main critique, most critics would say that this is the best fighting game for the Nintendo 64, which, let's face it, that's not really too hard to be. But let's see if these statements stand the test of time, starting with:
pick your character, don't want to represent your life. You start with anybody, so make your choice right. Select and make your first pick. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. Choose and pick the best one. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Now for a bit of clarification, I don't want to combine the gameplay and story aspects often, but when you have a game like Fighter's Destiny whose story is that there's a fighting tournament happening, yeah, that's it. I wanted there to be some kind of story to talk about, because this could have helped flesh out the characters that are really fucking generic with just their designs. But without it, we're just stuck with the uninspired roster of characters. Thankfully, the gameplay easily carries Fighter's Destiny, especially with its unique point match system. Unlike most fighting games where you have about 2, possibly 3 rounds per match, instead Fighter's Destiny's rounds are done in a similar manner as traditional martial arts tournaments. Instead of winning rounds, you are instead trying to get specific points from specific conditions. From knockdowns, grabs, and ring outs are just a few. By default, you need about 8 points to win a match. We're going to talk about each way of getting a point, starting from the lowest and working our way up. Starting with the ring out, which gives a singular point, and I agree with the low amount of points it gives. It's a pretty neat spin on the ring out, a feature that almost all 3D fighters were doing at the time, but with it rewarding 1 point encourages you to not be too aggressive, as you don't want to back your opponent to a corner, because if you do, you can lose out on a potential 2 to 3 points. Now I believe that this is the intention with the mechanic, but it spawns new problems that weren't there before. For starters, a player or AI can realize that they're losing and just dive bomb off the edge, which can be beneficial if your opponent is about to win, just jump off in order to save some points. Now I have noticed the AI be really weird with this mechanic, as when they're doing really good in a match, sometimes they'll still run off to the edge. They'll just sit there and hang there, and I think it's because they want to try to grab you off, which if they're about to win 3 points off of a knockout, it's really weird to see because it's not worth the risk, because getting it off only gives you 1 point, and you could still get hit, killing you instantly. So while it's a neat concept, it needs more work, as there has to be something to penalize those who just want to dive bomb, because sometimes it's easier to just lose that 1 point than it is to risk everything. The second 1-pointer is winning by timeout. Unlike other fighting games, the game opts for a 30-second timer for a round by default, which is blazing fast, and it does work in the game's favor, as Fighter's Destiny doesn't have enough to it to warrant longer rounds. But with such a small timer, it doesn't follow the idea that the person with the most health wins the round by timeout. Instead, the game has a group of virtual judges that rate the amount of different combos that damage the enemy. If you have a higher score than your opponent, you get the point. Or I think that's how it works, it's not too clear, but if you get more points than your opponent, then you get that round. It's a mechanic that I do like how it's handled, since this prevents people from just running around to have the most health at the end, and it also encourages you to experiment with different combos for the judges. Onto the two-pointers, starting with the throw, a twist and a classic fighting move. So in most games, grabs tend to be a way to punish a player that's been blocking for too much, or just to have a mix-up of some sort. Here, getting a successful grab nabs you 2 points, which sounds like a nightmare mechanic, but it's handled well. So when someone is grabbed, a timer will appear on the screen letting you know how long you have to get out of it. To do so, you just press the grab button yourself and it keeps the fight going. Or if you're feeling spicy, you could use a reversal, which I think all characters have. These have really tight windows to stop it, or you can have a really stupid looking reverse chain if you're good at the timing. I'm not, and I've only managed to get this off once, and it is super satisfying to actually pull it off. I think it's a good spin and makes grabs feel more satisfying to do, especially if you can get a successful mix-up off of one of them. The next two are the big ones, earning 3 points. Starting us off is the counter. This one is just a flat-out bad mechanic. Countering an enemy is a simple input, and if done right, it can drop an opponent in a single hit. I think the idea is that in a real life, a counter could be a way to just end a fight immediately, which is neat in paper, but in practice, this leads to a lot more problems than I think they were expecting. Like, if you can get the timings down right, you can end a round in the first few seconds consistently. There is a way to recover, but I don't understand how that works at all, and I haven't seen it be done too often. Maybe it's just timing based, where if you don't get a perfect counter, there's a chance of recovery. I'm not saying to fully get rid of the counter mechanic, instead just get rid of it being a method of getting points. Because the fact that you can lose with one mistake is dumb. Now I know in fighting games you can lose to a player in one move, but normally that's just because it's a really skilled player. Like a pro player that needs a long string of combos to make that happen still needs a good amount of skill versus I pressed 2 buttons and instantly won the match. If the death reason was because your character falls on the ground and that's why you get a point, is lame since you can do air combos and the characters will fall on the ground and just get back up. The only interesting aspect to this mechanic is that I can watch the AI have an existential crisis in real time, as it doesn't know what to do after a match of just getting countered constantly, which is really odd and kind of funny to watch the AI go from being really competent to brain dead because it doesn't know what to do anymore. But again, it's the only scoring method that feels really bad. The second third point method is knockdown, which is pretty straightforward of just knocking your opponent out. But we do have some interesting quirks, and to start this off, we're going to talk about the character's health. It works like your basic health, where if you take damage, it goes down, but there isn't any chip damage, and if you don't take damage for a long enough time, you start to heal. It's weird at first, but it's to promote you to stay aggressive, because you can lose all that damage you just dished out by just being passive. When your health gets to 0, you get stunned, where you can't fight back, but you can still move, where your new goal is to just avoid being hit by your opponent, as there are dedicated hits that will cause you to fall and finish the match. During this state, your health goes back rapidly, and if it fills back up, you're back in the game. If this was any other fighting game, I think this mechanic would actually suck, but everything else that's put into place here, it all works out surprisingly well, as it does add some tension of you trying to hit your opponent and they would just sit there and dodge, except for the moments where the AI has some really insane input reading, like get the fuck down here. While on this topic, it's time to talk about the special knockouts. So when your opponent's in the stun state, you can pull off a super. These supers are super generic, and they just kind of follow other supers at the time, so they're not really worthwhile to do it for the spectacle. For the conditions that you need are stunning your opponent and then using a very specific input to get 4 points, it's a mechanic that I could take or leave. It doesn't really add much, but it can also be seen as a way for you to make a comeback. I'm very split on this one because I know a lot of fighters have specials to add to their own spectacle and style, but here, for how generic they are, I'm starting to lean a lot more on take this out of the game so that it fits more of the whole martial arts tournament theme, and that explains most of the game mechanics, so let's talk about how the actual fighting plays out. Fighter's Destiny is a 2-button fighter, giving the game an easier barrier of entry, and it's a pretty fun game. My biggest problem is that the game's combo inputs aren't too varied, something that a few reviews at the time would also say, but considering that this game came out on the Nintendo 64, which has this controller, a controller that really isn't friendly for fighting games, or a lot of games in general, to the point where a lot of other fighting games opt to use the C buttons, and the C buttons aren't the best feeling buttons to press for long periods, and at least the combos looking far more overcomplicated than they really have to be. Another thing that was also remarked in the reviews at the time, but overall I feel like they picked the best choice for the console it's on, but we also had the Hariri mechanic. I don't think I'm saying this right at all, so bear with me. This is a really bad mechanic in my eyes. As my first impressions, I thought this was just a way of doing the whole quick step. Something I didn't do for most of the game because the rings are so small that I didn't really need to quick step in there. Plus, with me having to hold another button in order to do quick step, I kinda didn't even know that it was there in the first place. Upon finding out that it existed, I went to the arcade to see how useful this is. Only to click it and to see that my character dodges on its own. Why? This sucks as it can dodge highs and lows and even combos that have mix-ups in them. The only downside is that if your opponent grabs you, it becomes an unblockable. I hate this, as it takes away a lot of the learning and understanding of the combat. Plus, this could also actively get rid of mind games, because who cares about your mix-up if the Hariri can dodge it all? It just lowers the satisfaction in combat for me personally, but the game doesn't really say much on this feature, leading me to not find out about it, so I'm going to end up being a lot more lenient with it, and that's just because I didn't know about it, and to be frank, 99% of the review is played without it, and I don't think it needs this at all. But the reason I didn't find this is because I just play this like I do every other fighting game. I just hop in there and practice with a character that looks neat. And for me, it's this white-haired looking chick that I can never remember the name of. But the game didn't feel like it needed something like this. It didn't even feel like it needed sidestepping, as the arenas are just so small. There are so many mechanics that already work in its favor that it just feels pointless. Like, yeah, I can get backed into a corner and try sidestepping away, or I could do the really risky thing of going on the edge and grabbing my opponent. I could leapfrog over my opponent, and then all the distance that they push me towards the corner of the ring is now used against them. Or I could even just counter the opponent with the whole counter mechanic. There's so many other things that you can do that it just doesn't feel like it's needed. There's never a moment where I need to close the gap, as most of the characters have a good amount of range to all of them. Now I could use this to explain the AI and their input reading, as they're just using the Hariri, except knowing that a grab is an unblockable shatters the illusion that they're even using this, because there is never an unblockable grab when you do it against the AI. There's a manual block with Z or right trigger, and that's really it on the controls. It plays really well for what it has and for the console it's on, and it's punching past its own weight with the amount of game modes it has. The first is the traditional arcade mode, where you fight against a set group of enemies. Unfortunately, the enemies aren't randomized, so the latter can get pretty stale quickly. Then you have the Master Challenge, that gives you a roulette where you can kill a master to get new moves or characters. But you can also get the moves from the arcade mode, and look, I get it, at the N64 you could only have so much data, so this was their method to get more replayability out of the game, but I don't think it's great replayability, as I just want the entire moveset right from the start. Now I will give them props, the moves that you do get aren't too crazy or vital for the characters, so you're not missing out on too much if you don't sit there and grind for it. But with the console and the lack of other fighting games, I think the 5 unlockable characters is enough replayability. Now I get the idea that you want to sit there and unlock all the moves, save them to your memory pack, and then go to your friend's house and each one would have different moves, encouraging the other player to play more. But that novelty is lost these days. We also have a training mode, which has different areas that you can dedicate to, from aerial, normal, to special moves. It's slightly clunky, but it works, and a quick thing I want to mention while we're on the training is that when you do combos, there isn't something that's telling you the number of hits that you did. That's only reserved for aerial combos, and it tells you how many hits you do there for some reason. But then you have the record attack, which is 3 different modes in one little section. The first is the fastest, where the task is simple to beat 4 enemies as fast as you can. If you do it under a minute, you unlock Robert, the training robot. Rodeo tasks you for living as long as you can, and if you last for a minute, you get Ushi the cow. Then the hardest is survival, defeat as many opponents in a row. It's a fun turn off your brain mode, but if you want all the characters, then this turn off your brain mode gets fucking tedious, as you're forced to survive 100 enemies, which has to be done with 1 life. And there's no continues, and this is just to get the Joker character, who isn't really great, so it's really tedious for no reason. And that's about it for the gameplay, but I don't know where else to put this, so I want to say it now. This game has a lot of options, to the point where it feels a lot more like a modern day game than it does a Nintendo 64 game. I know it's a weird thing to praise a game on this, but with the late 90s and early 2000s, it was a mixed bag on what options you would actually get. I mean, for crying out loud, there were so many AAA games on the PS2 that didn't have a brightness slider, but this includes the gameplay portion and brings us to the Now the gameplay had a lot of praises and stuff, and that's not going to be shared on the graphics, because Fighter's Destiny is an ugly looking game during an ugly period of gaming. Let's talk about it on a technical sense, as all the characters are pretty low poly, which is normal for the N64, but little is being shown, to the point where they really should have put more time and work on the character models. But the textures also aren't aligned properly, and you can see the seams throughout all the characters. The best 3D aspect to the stage itself is just the ground, which isn't anything to brag about since it's just a cube. Now the backgrounds were also criticized for being just these crunchy images for the time, and I'll be honest, it looks alright and it's aged pretty well. Sure, the backgrounds are just some pretty crunchy images in there, but it looks a lot better than some of the other 3D fighting games that just use polygons. It also managed to avoid the odd looking background and stage moving. It's a weird thing to explain, but it still happens to 3D fighters these days. Well, the latest one that I've noticed it happening in is Tekken 7, but to quickly show what I'm talking about, here's some Tekken 3 gameplay, and if you watch the ground and the wall, you can see that they're moving independently. I think they do this to keep the stage in a certain kind of frame that that they want to show the fight in. It might be a weird thing to even like point out right now, but like it's such a hard thing to not unnotice when you play so many 3D fighting games, and thankfully Fighters Destiny doesn't have this. I mean, sure, it's saying that all the backgrounds are static images, but remember, this is the early stages of 3D fighting still, so there still wasn't a crazy amount of experience with creating 3D graphics and 3D backgrounds, so there wasn't an option of getting super detailed backgrounds like there was for the 2D games, since by then the industry has had 10 plus years to really perfect the 2D background. Plus, Genkei isn't Namco or Sega, who pour millions into their 3D fighters, pushing the visuals so that their arcade machines stood out more. Especially Sega, who spent millions of dollars just to develop a singular chip, which required them to buy some technology from either the military or some really big company, I don't remember which one. But Genkei wasn't putting that kind of money on the table, so I'll say that they're pretty good for what they had. Now I know that they were also the team that ported Virtua Fighter 3 TB, so they could do better, except no, they just ported the game, meaning that they didn't make any of the assets for that game. Sega did all of that. So on the technical side of things, everything looks great except for the character models. But on the art direction side of things, it's super generic, especially for the character designs. As you can see, the other fighting games that influenced all the designs, but this just kind of screams out that the team was less interested in making a unique looking game and unique characters, but instead they pushed all their unique aspects onto the gameplay thing, and I think it worked really well for Fighters Destiny. Sure, the characters aren't rememberable, but the gameplay does stay rememberable. Now we have one more area to look at with the welcome to the weakest part to any of my reviews, because I just don't feel like I have confidence in this area compared to others. So let's rip this band-aid off right now, as the music is rather generic. Which is a shame, because this could have done some heavy lifting to redeeming the stages. But this doesn't really have music that hypes you up for a fight. There's about 2 or 3 that does it, and the music's not bad, it's just it could be used for really any other game. The game also doesn't sound that great, as most of the sounds are compressed to hell and back. It's standard for the time in the console, but the sounds that are already used also don't have much impact to them. And while their announcer just won't shut the fuck up during an actual match, leaving for the soundscape to really just be damage noise, nice, or fight harder. And it gets really grating pretty fast half the time. That's the most I have in sounds, and hopefully the longer I start doing these reviews and all that, the longer this section will get. But for now, we're going to move on to Fighters Destiny has some really fun gameplay, and it's pretty good at what it does. But there are too many flaws that prevent me from putting this in an SSS or A tier. However, it's definitely at a high B tier, as it's a pretty fun and definitely one of the top 3 fighters on the N64. So, I'm bad at outros, so if you enjoy this, why not subscribe? Until next time, have a fantastic day.